Hollywood built trucks that should never have worked. A Kenworth semi doing wheelies with live explosives. A 12-wheeled tank jumping 25 feet. A Mad Max Cadillac monster that required engineers to literally invent a new gearbox. But here's what's wild. These weren't just insane stunts. These engineering nightmares actually changed how movies are made. They proved that practical effects could do things CGI still can't. And some were so dangerous that stunt drivers actually refused to get behind the wheel. Today we're breaking down 20 shocking engineering feats from the most outrageous movie trucks ever created. Trucks that cost more than houses, engines rebuilt between every single take, and the Terminator 2 liquid nitrogen tanker that nearly killed 2 stuntmen on its first attempt. By the end, you'll see why these weren't props. They were innovations disguised as stunts. Let's go back to 1989. James Bond is being chased through a mountain pass in a Kenworth W900B semi-truck, and what happens next became one of the most iconic stunts ever filmed. The truck lifts up on its back wheels and accelerates, balancing on 2 tires while moving at high speed, explosions erupting around it. For most viewers, this is just movie magic. The reality of what happened is far more extreme. The stunt driver wasn't balancing on luck. He was balancing on engineering. The producers hired Remy Julien, one of the world's most expensive stunt coordinators, and gave him a budget that exceeded $1 million just for the truck sequences. What he built with that budget was a Kenworth modified so heavily that it became almost unrecognizable as a truck. The base engine was already producing around 400 horsepower. That wasn't close to enough. Engineers installed a massive supercharged V8 that pushed output to 1,000 horsepower, 2.5 times the factory specification. But raw power wasn't the secret to the wheelie. The suspension was completely rebuilt. Heavy-duty air springs were installed, and the entire rear axle assembly was reinforced with custom materials to handle the lateral forces of a truck, literally balancing on 2 wheels. Here's where it gets wild. To make the wheelie controllable, engineers installed a dual steering mechanism. The concept sounds simple. Control the truck from 2 positions, but in practice it was a nightmare. 2 drivers had to be in perfect synchronization. One drove the truck, another hid inside a reinforced cabin controlling a secondary set of wheels. Their timing had to be flawless, because if they weren't perfectly coordinated, the entire truck would flip sideways and crush everything inside. They didn't just build one. They built 16 separate Kenworth W900B trucks, all modified for different aspects of the sequence. Most were stripped down to shells. Some were rigged with cameras mounted to their chassis to capture footage from angles that seemed impossible. Others had reinforced cabs to protect the hidden stunt drivers. Each truck cost tens of thousands of dollars to modify, and many were damaged or destroyed after their single stunt moment. But the wheelie wasn't even the most insane part. In another sequence, the same truck launches itself off a ramp and rolls barrel after barrel down a mountain road, flattening everything in its path. The engineers had to reinforce the frame to withstand the impact of multiple barrel collisions without the structure collapsing. They added internal roll cages and padding that made the cab feel less like a vehicle interior and more like the inside of a tank. The practical effect was so convincing that audiences genuinely believed they were watching an impossible truck performing impossible feats. What they didn't know was that 3 months of engineering, 16 trucks, and stunt drivers who had to have nerves of absolute steel made every second of that chase sequence possible. But this wheelie truck was just the beginning of an arms race that would define action cinema for the next 3 decades. Flash forward to 2015. Director George Miller is creating Mad Max Fury Road, and he wants something that will make every previous movie truck look ordinary. What he asks for is insane. Take 2 1959 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, stack them vertically on top of each other, and make it a functional vehicle. To most engineers, this is an immediate no. You'd destroy the structural integrity. The weight distribution would be impossible. The center of gravity would be catastrophic. The Cadillacs were built for cruising, not for existing in any configuration beyond a horizontal plane. The Mad Max team ignored every objection and built it anyway. They started with actual Cadillac frames, but stripped everything unnecessary. The goal was to create something that looked impossibly heavy while being just light enough to drive. They removed interiors, cut away fenders, and designed a custom steel cradle that would hold both Cadillacs in permanent alignment while allowing them to function as a single moving unit. The engine situation was even more extreme than the Kenworth. Mad Max engineers installed not 1, but 2 Chevrolet V8 engines, specifically 502 cubic inch big blocks with superchargers. Each engine produced 600 horsepower. Combined, that was 2,200 horsepower of pure mechanical fury. The idea was that dual engines would provide reliability and redundancy. If one failed mid-scene, the other would keep the vehicle moving. In practice, it meant the Gigahorse had enough power to accelerate like a drag racer, except it weighed 4 times what a normal car weighs. Here's the problem that killed production scheduling. The engineers had to invent a gearbox system that didn't exist. Conventional transmissions couldn't handle the power output from 2 engines working simultaneously. They designed a custom system that would distribute power from both engines to the wheels while preventing one from fighting the other. This took weeks to engineer, and the solution they created was fragile. Incredibly fragile. The Gigahorse could theoretically generate 200 horsepower, but its actual top speed was around 60 miles per hour. That's not because of governor limiters or safety restrictions. It's because at any speed above 60 mph, the custom transmission started breaking down. The metal components inside were being stressed beyond their theoretical limits by the sheer power coursing through them, and that transmission broke constantly. During filming in the Australian desert, the Gigahorse was in heavy use. Multiple sequences required the vehicle to accelerate, perform tight turns, and navigate rough terrain. After nearly every single day of filming, technicians had to remove the transmission entirely, inspect it for damage, repair components that were beginning to crack or deform, and reassemble it for the next day's shoot. This wasn't occasional maintenance. This was the expected reality of operating the vehicle. The Gigahorse appears in multiple sequences throughout the film, and if you watch carefully, you can see the damage accumulating on the body panels as production continued. Small dents that weren't there before. Paint chips from minor collisions. These weren't created by stunt choreography. They were the result of a machine being pushed beyond its design limits day after day. But here's what makes the Gigahorse remarkable. It works. The camera captures something authentic. When the Gigahorse accelerates in that film, you're watching 2 supercharged V8 engines actually straining against each other. 2 Cadillacs stacked vertically actually staying in formation, and a transmission actually on the verge of catastrophic failure. That authenticity is impossible to fake. No amount of CGI can replicate the subtle movements of metal being stressed, the slight wobble of a component about to fail, or the genuine danger radiating from a machine operating at its absolute threshold. George Miller's decision to engineer this truck rather than create it digitally changed how audiences experience the film. It made Fury Road feel real in a way that most modern action movies don't, because underneath every stunt was mechanical reality, dangerous, expensive, and unforgiving. Now we move to what might be the most dangerous stunt ever filmed. Terminator 2. Judgment Day, 1991. Director James Cameron wanted to create a moment where a massive truck performs a perfect barrel roll while carrying real, functional liquid nitrogen. Not a dummy truck. Not a scale model. A real vehicle. Actually flipping. Actually carrying 10,000 gallons of liquid nitrogen, while 2 stunt drivers sat inside. The truck selected was a Peterbilt tanker. It was a real working vehicle, not a purpose-built stunt rig. The issue was that liquid nitrogen is incredibly volatile. If the truck flipped incorrectly, if the tank ruptured, if the cooling system was compromised in any way, the people inside would face exposure to liquid that exists at -321 degrees Fahrenheit. Essentially, they'd be exposed to something colder than the surface of Pluto. The engineers designed a reinforced steel roll cage inside the cab. This cage wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be indestructible. Steel bars crisscrossed the interior in patterns that would catch and support the cabin structure during a rollover. The drivers wore protective gear that looked more appropriate for deep-sea exploration than stunt work. Multiple safety protocols were layered on top of each other. During the first attempt, everything went wrong in the way that first attempts sometimes do. The truck hit the ramp at the specified speed and angle. It rotated correctly, began the barrel roll, and then something in the dynamics shifted. The truck didn't stop at one complete rotation. It kept rolling, barrel rolling across the street, crushing the cab downward with each revolution. The internal roll cage was the only thing that saved both drivers' lives. They walked away with injuries but alive. If that cage hadn't been there, they would have been crushed. James Cameron stopped production, analyzed what happened, and decided to proceed anyway. He adjusted the ramp angle and tried again. This time it worked perfectly. The truck flipped exactly once, rotated with precision, and came to rest upright. The camera captured it flawlessly, liquid nitrogen actually sloshing inside the tank. The physical reality of a massive vehicle being inverted, the genuine danger present in every frame. What's remarkable is that Cameron used real liquid nitrogen instead of a substitute. Many directors might have used food coloring and water to create the illusion of sloshing liquid. Cameron insisted on authenticity. The liquid nitrogen was real, functional, and deadly. It's a detail that almost nobody notices, but it's visible in the footage. When the tank rotates, the liquid inside doesn't behave like water or dyed liquid. It has different viscosity, different reflective properties. The authenticity is subtle but present. The stunt became legendary, but what followed was even more innovative. This was 1991. Digital effects were nascent. The only way to remove the safety cables and rigs from the footage was to physically hide them during filming. Except that's impossible during a complex role with multiple camera angles. So Cameron's team did something unprecedented. They used digital technology to remove the wires frame by frame, painting over them with information from surrounding frames. This was one of the first times digital effects were used for safety wire removal, and it was extraordinarily labor-intensive. Weeks of work by technicians to erase what was never supposed to be there. The Terminator 2 tanker stunt became the gold standard for how to combine real mechanical engineering with practical stunt work. It proved that you could push the boundaries of safety without crossing into recklessness, though it came extremely close. Before the Kenworth, before the Gigahorse, before the Terminator truck, there was something that shouldn't have existed in 1977, the Landmaster. It came from a film called Damnation Alley, a post-apocalyptic movie starring Jan Michael Vincent. The plot is relatively forgotten, but the vehicle in it became a legend among stunt drivers and engineers. The Landmaster is difficult to describe because there's genuinely nothing else like it. Imagine a vehicle where one section of the frame is rotated 90 degrees perpendicular to the rest, creating a vehicle with wheels pointing in 3 different directions simultaneously. Now imagine it has 12 wheels total, all independently driven. Add amphibious capabilities, so it can float on water. Add the ability to jump 25 feet into the air and land on terrain so rough that most vehicles would be damaged beyond repair. Add armor plating that could withstand impacts from boulders and debris. The Landmaster was built by a team of engineers from a company that specialized in military vehicle design. The concept came from a Pulp Fiction book, and the filmmakers decided to make it real. The base frame was constructed from steel tubing, incredibly overbuilt because the engineers weren't entirely sure what forces would be applied to it during filming. The engine was a 390 cubic inch Ford V8. That's not particularly large by modern standards, but in the context of a 10.5-ton vehicle with amphibious capabilities, it was adequate. The genius wasn't in raw horsepower, it was in how that power was distributed. The engineers designed a system where the 12 wheels could be independently driven, meaning that even if the vehicle was on extremely uneven terrain, each wheel could maintain traction. This was decades before computerized torque vectoring became common in high-end vehicles. The suspension system used hydraulic lifts that could raise or lower the vehicle by several feet. This allowed the Landmaster to climb over obstacles that would stop conventional vehicles, to lower itself for water amphibious operations, and to adjust its ride height for different terrain conditions. The hydraulic system was complex enough that it required constant maintenance between takes. The cost was staggering for 1977. The Landmaster budget came to approximately $350,000. That's $1.8 million in modern money, for a single vehicle that would appear in a B-movie that most people have forgotten about. The filmmakers invested that much money because the Landmaster was the entire draw of the film. Everything else was secondary. What's interesting is that the engineers built something so advanced that it actually inspired decades of future designs. The vehicle was so far ahead of its time that modern manufacturers are still designing all-terrain vehicles using principles that Damnation Alley engineers pioneered. Only one functional Landmaster was ever built, but clever filming made it appear as though there were 2. They shot scenes of it from multiple angles, edited sequences to create the illusion that it was in 2 places simultaneously, and used scale models for certain stunt sequences where real testing had shown it was safer to use miniatures than risk destroying the full-size vehicle. Building these trucks was one expense. Actually filming with them was another entirely. When producers hired stunt coordinators for these vehicles, the budget spiraled upward in ways that seem incomprehensible today. For License to Kill, the stunt budget for just the truck chase sequences exceeded $1 million. This wasn't going toward the truck itself. That was a separate cost. This was the actual filming, the multiple takes required to get perfect footage, the insurance, the safety crews, the medical personnel on standby, the road closures, the equipment rentals. The sequences were filmed in different locations over several weeks, which meant transporting all 16 modified Kenworths to each location, setting up ramps, installing camera equipment, and coordinating dozens of stunt drivers and technicians. Remy Julien, the stunt coordinator, was one of the most expensive in the world. His fee alone for the License to Kill work was substantial, but he came with expertise that couldn't be replicated. He had designed stunts for the Bond franchise before. He understood the mathematics of vehicle dynamics, the tolerances required for safety, and the angles needed to create maximum visual impact. You weren't just paying for a person. You were paying for decades of accumulated knowledge. The human element of these stunts deserves attention because it's often overshadowed by the engineering. During Terminator 2, a stunt performer named Peter Kent executed some of the most dangerous sequences. He performed a motorcycle jump with no safety rig whatsoever. The bike launches off a ramp, soars across a distance that seems impossible, and lands on the other side. If Kent had misjudged the angle or the speed, he would have crashed into concrete at 60 miles per hour. There was no net, no airbag, no emergency backup, just skill, timing, and an acceptance of mortality. The near disasters didn't always become legendary stunts. Sometimes they were close calls that almost ended productions. The scope of some productions is hard to comprehend. For the License to Kill truck chase, the production rented over 5.5 miles of actual highway in Spain. They kept this road closed for 3 full weeks. During that time, they installed lighting rigs, positioned camera equipment, marked approach angles for the stunt drivers, and established medical stations along the entire route. The electricity requirements alone were substantial enough to require temporary power substations. The logistics were equivalent to building a small temporary city, dedicated entirely to a single film sequence. These trucks weren't built with the expectation that they would have long service lives. Many were constructed with the explicit plan that they would be crashed, flipped, rolled, or destroyed during filming. Budget was allocated for destruction. Engineers knew in advance that their creation would be obliterated, and they designed accordingly. Some vehicles were built for a single stunt, knowing that after the camera stopped rolling, the truck would be scrapped or sold for parts. The financial reality was that practical stunt work was extraordinarily expensive. But the alternative, trying to create the same sequences digitally, was seen as impossible. CGI in the 1980s and 1990s wasn't advanced enough to create vehicles that looked convincing during dynamic movement. So instead of spending millions on digital effects that wouldn't work, producers spent millions on engineering real trucks that would. Not every truck that was engineered for a film made it to screen in the way its designers intended. Some were deemed too dangerous. Some were modified so extensively that they became liabilities rather than assets. And some stunt drivers literally refused to operate them. In Mad Max Fury Road, alongside the Gigahorse, there was another vehicle called Cranky Frank. It's a modified Holden Ute, an Australian pickup truck that had been stripped down and rebuilt as a high-speed chase vehicle. The concept was straightforward. Create a rat rod-style vehicle that looks fearsome and drives erratically through the desert. The engineering had one critical flaw. The driver's visibility was nearly non-existent. The modifications had added so much bodywork, had repositioned windows in such strange angles, and had reconfigured the entire cab structure to the point where the person driving couldn't actually see most of the road. They could see directly ahead, but peripheral vision was eliminated. Looking to the sides was impossible. Looking backward was completely blocked. Cranky Frank was supposed to be piloted through desert terrain at high speed, but stunt drivers tested it and refused to continue. The risk wasn't just physical, it was fundamental. If you can't see your environment while driving at 60 miles per hour over rough ground, you're not driving a vehicle. You're piloting a missile with zero situational awareness. Multiple stunt drivers declined the job. George Miller had designed this thing to be unsafe by its very nature, as part of the post-apocalyptic aesthetic. But the moment it had to be actually driven by a human, the design became untenable. Cranky Frank still made it into the final film, but its screen time is limited and strictly controlled. When it appears, it's usually in wide shots where the audience can see the vehicle, but the limitations of the driving visibility aren't apparent. During more complex scenes, doubles and stunt performers were used, but their nervousness while operating the vehicle is visible in how hesitantly it moves. You can actually see the caution in the driving. This isn't an aggressive, confident vehicle being piloted. It's a dangerous machine being carefully maneuvered by someone acutely aware that one mistake could be catastrophic. The decision to leave Cranky Frank in the film despite its dangers was a choice by the filmmakers to preserve the aesthetic. In a post-apocalyptic film, you want vehicles that feel jury-rigged, improvised, and potentially unsafe. Cranky Frank achieved that, but not without cost. The insurance company had strict requirements about where and how it could be operated. The stunt coordinator had to approve every sequence. Safety teams were positioned closer than usual. The entire production adapted around the reality that this one vehicle was genuinely dangerous. There were trucks planned for various films that never made it to production at all. Studios would sometimes commission designs that seemed feasible until engineers actually started building them. The cost would balloon, the complexity would increase, and eventually someone would say, "This is too dangerous or too expensive." At that point, the project would be shelved. You never hear about these abandoned vehicles because they never appear in films. but they exist in archival documentation and old production notes. The ones that did make it to screen, like Cranky Frank, carry with them the implicit message that the filmmakers were willing to accept certain risks for authenticity. In modern filmmaking, risk-averse approaches mean that fewer and fewer stunts happen with real vehicles. But in the 1980s and 1990s, there was still a culture where danger was accepted as part of the creative process. One of the strangest consequences of the license to kill truck stunts was something nobody anticipated. Kenworth truck sales increased, not dramatically, but measurably. After audiences saw a Kenworth W900B doing wheelies and flying through explosions, some truck drivers and fleet operators wanted one. The association between the truck and James Bond's impossible feats became permanent in the public consciousness. Kenworth capitalized on this. The company released marketing materials emphasizing the truck's power and capabilities. They highlighted the fact that their vehicle had been trusted to perform movie stunts. It was indirect, but it worked. The truck became iconic not just as a film vehicle, but as a real-world symbol of performance and engineering excellence. The Gigahorse effect was different. Mad Max Fury Road created such a specific, unique machine that it couldn't be replicated in marketing. You can't buy a Gigahorse. You can't see one driving down the street, but what you could do was talk about it, write about it, and use it as evidence that practical engineering could still create spectacle. In a film industry increasingly dependent on digital effects, the Gigahorse proved that real machines could still capture imaginations. During the production of Mad Max Fury Road, George Miller employed 150 different vehicles. The investment in practical vehicles has diminished proportionally. When you can create a truck digitally, why spend millions engineering a real one? The answer, according to filmmakers who still prefer practical stunts, is authenticity. Digital trucks move differently than real trucks. They don't have weight. They don't have inertia. They don't have the subtle vibrations and movements that come from actual metal and mechanics being stressed. Audiences might not consciously notice these details, but subconsciously they feel the difference. A real truck has presence. A digital truck, no matter how well rendered, has the uncanny quality of something that doesn't quite exist. The Mad Max franchise proved that audiences respond to that presence. Fury Road was released in 2015, years after digital effects had become the dominant technology in action films. But audiences embraced it specifically because so much of the action was real. You weren't watching simulation, you were watching actual vehicles performing actual stunts. That authenticity created an emotional response that digital effects couldn't match. But here's what's remarkable. The Kenworth wheelie truck cost less to engineer than a single minute of modern CGI effects. The Gigahorse, for all its complexity, was cheaper to build and film than the digital rendering of a superhero in flight. The filmmakers of the 1980s and 1990s found it economically efficient to engineer the impossible because the digital alternative was more expensive and less convincing. These trucks represented a philosophy that's nearly extinct. It was the idea that if you wanted to show something extraordinary on film, you should actually build it. You should push engineering to its absolute limits, accept the risks that came with that, and capture the results on camera. The truck would only exist during its moment in the film, but that moment would be authentic in a way that would resonate with audiences decades later. Today, when we watch these sequences, we're watching the ghosts of engineering ambitions that no longer exist. A modern director wouldn't commission 16 modified trucks to film a chase sequence. It would be visualized, storyboarded, and created in post-production by artists who would never touch a physical vehicle. The trucks in License to Kill, Terminator 2, and Fury Road are artifacts of a specific moment in cinema when the impossible was approached not by animation, but by mechanics. The trucks proved something that digital artists are still discovering. There's a value to the physical world that simulation can't replicate. A transmission that actually brakes, a suspension that actually strains, a driver who actually feels danger. These create an authenticity that no amount of rendering can match. These trucks, modified beyond recognition, pushed to their absolute limits, and sometimes even destroyed in service of a single cinematic moment, represent a form of filmmaking that prioritized presence over efficiency. And maybe that's the most important legacy. Not that these trucks existed, but that they embodied a philosophy of creation that said, if it's worth showing, it's worth building. If it's worth filming, it's worth making it real. That approach has become rarer, more expensive, and more difficult to justify in modern productions. But it created moments of cinema that are still talked about 30 years later, because audiences feel the difference between a truck that was actually engineered and a truck that was digitally created. They feel the presence. They feel the authenticity. The Kenworth wheelie truck, the Gigahorse, the Terminator tanker, and the Landmaster. They're not just movie vehicles. They're monuments to an era when engineering the impossible was seen as more valuable than simulating it. And that's something worth remembering every time you watch a modern film filled with digital effects, but missing the presence of real machinery, pushed to its absolute limits.